This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome to the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA, introductory course on contamination provided by the Florida Department of Transportation's Office of Environmental Management, as covered in Part 2, Chapter 20 of the Project Development and Environment Manual. This course presents guidance on identifying, evaluating, and handling potential contamination issues associated with FDOT projects in all phases of the project development process: planning, project development and environment, or PD&E, design, and construction, to comply with federal and state laws and regulations. This course is provided in the 8 lessons listed on this slide. Lesson 1 will provide an overview of the contamination investigation in the project development process, the related regulations, and the purpose of performing a contamination evaluation. Florida's requirements for pollution prevention and control are contained in Chapters 376 and 403 Florida statutes. Additionally, Chapter 337.27, parens 4 of the Florida statutes provides when the department acquires property for transportation facilities or in a transportation corridor through the exercise of eminent domain and authority, or by the purchase or donation, it is not subject to any liability imposed by Chapter 376 Florida statutes or Chapter 403 Florida statutes for pre-existing soil and groundwater contamination due solely to its ownership. This section does not affect the rights or liabilities of any past, present, or future owners of the acquired property, nor does it affect the liability of any governmental entity for the results of its actions which create or exacerbate a pollution source. This underscores the need for FDOT to understand the type and extent of contamination issues and the need to address them early and properly to reduce costs and risks to the OT. State requirements for dealing with hazardous waste and the rehabilitation of contaminated sites are outlined in Chapter 62-730, Hazardous Waste of the Florida Administrative Code, and Chapter 62-780, Contaminated Site Cleanup Criteria. Additional applicable federal laws and regulations include the following. Federal regulations including the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, as amended by Hazardous and Solid Waste Amendments, HSWA, which deal with waste management to protect human health and the environment from the potential hazards of waste disposal. The Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, CERCLA, as amended by the Superfund Amendment and Reauthorization Act, SARA, sets federal requirements for responding to spills and hazardous substances and establishes liabilities for cleanup costs. 1988 FHWA Interim Guidance Document emphasizes identification and assessment of potentially contaminated sites early in project development. The 1998 FHWA Policy Revision encourages the use of brownfields for transportation purposes. Contamination within or adjacent to FDOT right-of-way has the potential for liability to FDOT through property ownership and due to contaminated hazardous material exposure, handling, and disposal, and may require assessment, remediation, or special handling. Additionally, contamination in soil, groundwater, surface water, sediments, and structures may have the following impacts to an FDOT project: human exposure, potential or actual human health concerns, exacerbation of the contamination by construction activities, design modifications or special construction provisions for work within contaminated areas, requirements for the proper handling and disposal of contaminated material, and potential costs and/or schedule impacts. Thus, understanding the type and extent of contaminated issues and addressing them early and properly can reduce costs and risks to FDOT. FDOT must utilize the best available information to identify, screen, evaluate, and remediate potential contamination impacts.
Lesson 2 will cover the overall procedure and the activities related to contamination evaluation as it is performed during each part of the project development process. Project involvement with contamination must be evaluated for all FDOT projects to minimize potential risks, liabilities, health and safety concerns, project delays, and cost overruns. Involvement with contamination can be in the form of potential exposure to contaminated soil, groundwater, other surface debris, or asbestos-containing materials, ACM, and metal-based coatings, MBC, during construction, as well as the potential for plume disturbance during construction, or the consideration of contaminants or underground storage tanks present or parcels identified for right-of-way acquisition. Contamination issues can be avoided or minimized by changing the project's design or remediated if they are identified early in the project development process. The benefit of early identification of contamination is to minimize unanticipated contamination encountered during construction of the project. The District Contamination Impact Coordinator, or DCIC, is the district's point of contact for all issues related to contamination impacts within the existing or proposed FDOT right-of-way. This includes coordination of contamination-related activities in all phases of the project. The next slides summarize contamination in each phase of the project development process. Evaluation of potential contamination impacts on PD&E projects begins when the district prepares the preliminary environmental discussion, or PED, for projects that are screened through the ETDM process. The ETDM process provides an opportunity for regulatory agencies to review the project. During the ETDM process, the planning screen helps identify potential contaminated sites within or adjacent to the project, while the programming screen helps determine whether a Level 1 investigation may be needed. The DCIC participates with other ETDM screening review staff to address comments made by the Environmental Technical Advisory Team, or ETAT. The project manager, or PM, should work with the DCIC to determine evaluation needs and the level of evaluation effort for contamination to be included in the scope of services for the PD&E study or contamination assessment and remediation CAR contract. As listed in Figure 20-1 of Part 2, Chapter 20 of the FDOT PD&E Manual, the following key points should be considered when reviewing a project for contamination issues. Status of assessment remediation on FDEP contamination sites, size and depth of plume if documented, petroleum only or other contaminants such as metals or solvents, presence of underground storage tanks or above ground storage tanks and/or other sources of contamination on properties obtained as FDOT right-of-way. Structures with ACM or MBC concerns, impacts to design, or are avoidance measures possible. Additional considerations: do assessments and remediation costs need to be considered as part of the 5-year work program? Can impacts be addressed prior to construction, or will there be involvement during construction? Will FDOT activities exacerbate contamination due to dewatering, use of sheet pilings, or due to pond construction? Will groundwater testing to address a NPDES dewatering permit be needed? During PD&E, a Level 1 evaluation or contamination screening is performed to screen known and potentially contaminated sites that may impact project alternatives. Each site is evaluated for impacts to each project alternative and is assigned a risk rating. Based on the assigned risk rating and the proposed construction activities in the area of potential contamination, the project manager and the DCIC coordinate actions that should be taken to address contamination issues. The Level 1 evaluation is documented in the Contamination Screening Evaluation Report, or CSER, with the findings summarized in the appropriate environmental documents. Projects with construction activities that can exacerbate soil or groundwater contamination warrant a more detailed evaluation in the next project phase. Projects with no or little expectation of impacts may be documented in a technical memorandum with identification of potentially contaminated sites within the project vicinity. Contaminated sites with a medium or high rating should be further evaluated in the next project phase. A Level 1 investigation is also known as a contamination screening evaluation. It consists of a desktop review, site reconnaissance, and review of historical records to identify all past and present potentially contaminating activities within or adjacent to the project. It is performed to determine the status of existing sites as well as the need for further assessment. Level 1 evaluations are normally completed during the PD&E phase or at Phase 1, 30% design plans for projects which do not have a PD&E study. The potential for contamination impacts should be considered during design, planning for right-of-way acquisition, and development of project design features. In some cases, contamination involvement can be avoided with minor design changes. Planned right-of-way acquisition should be evaluated for their potential contamination involvement. Also during design, potential pond sites or stormwater management facilities and floodplain compensation (FPC) areas should be further evaluated. If warranted, Level 2 investigations are performed during design. Drainage features and drainage easements should be evaluated if there are potential contamination impacts to construction activities. During design, the DCIC should coordinate with regulatory agencies such as FDEP for projects that may involve remediation, solid waste removal, or dewatering permits. The role of the DCIC expands to include coordination with the design project manager. This includes review of the design concept and review of all plans from Phase 1 through final plans. The DCIC's role during the design includes developing the scope for any additional design contamination studies, including mainline and pond CSERs. The DCIC follows up with the review of these studies. During design, a Level 2 investigation may be performed if needed. A Level 2 investigation consists of a detailed evaluation of potential project involvement with contamination. The Level 2 investigation considers the project scope of work as well as the potential for either handling or exacerbation of existing soil or groundwater contamination. When applicable, it also considers the need for acquisition of potentially contaminated parcels. Field investigations, such as soil sampling, groundwater sampling, and laboratory testing, are included when applicable. This is done to determine the presence of contamination and to develop remediations for Level 3 activities or avoidance measures if needed. A Level 2 investigation may also be known as an impact to construction assessment. All attempts are made to address contamination on the project prior to construction. However, when contamination impacts during construction cannot be avoided, the DCIC works with the construction project manager and the car contractor to perform any necessary Level 3 remediation activities needed during design. The roles of the DCIC include developing the scope and budgets for these activities, performing field inspections of the car contractor activities, and reviewing reports resulting from these activities. For projects with identified contamination issues, the DCIC should attend pre-construction meetings and coordinate closely with the construction project manager to ensure the contractor is fully aware of potential contamination involvement, commitments, remediation activities, avoidance measures, or any further coordination or measures needed. This may include coordination with the district's car contractor. The car contractor's activities are managed and funded through the DCIC's car contract. The DCIC and the construction project manager or engineer need to coordinate regarding project milestones. Also, during the construction phase, the DCIC should support the engineer on contamination-related matters and verify completion of any Level 3 activities. A Level 3 investigation may be performed during design or construction. A Level 3 investigation refers to additional evaluation from the Level 2 assessment and, as warranted, remediation of contamination or a detailed plan for removal and disposal of contaminated soil and/or groundwater, underground storage tank removal, or other similarly related activities that may directly impact construction activities or right-of-way acquisition and clearance. Level 3 activities can take place during design right-of-way acquisition, or construction.
Lesson 3 will cover the methods and elements included in a Level 1 investigation, also known as a contamination screening evaluation. The Level 1 evaluation is performed to screen potentially contaminated sites and determine potential contamination risks on each project alternative. The Level 1 evaluation consists of a desktop reviews and of the proposed project scope of work, contamination-related records, site reconnaissance field review, and interviews, estimating risk ratings, and preparation of a report or technical memorandum. If the Level 1 evaluation clearly finds no contamination issues in the project area, there is no need for further investigation, providing there are no new discharges causing contamination or no changes in the design or construction activities on the site that can exacerbate contamination issues. If sites are identified during the Level 1 evaluation that are rated medium or high, these sites are further considered for a Level 2 evaluation. The purpose of the desktop review is to identify potential contaminated sites and to evaluate the potential for encountering contamination from current or prior land uses. The review includes regulatory records that are now typically available online. Sources of data for desktop review are the Environmental Screening Tool, or EST, publicly available databases or databases from commercial environmental data service companies, databases maintained by federal, state, or local governments or regulatory agencies are most reliable sources of data for the desktop review. Desktop reviews may also include the review of available historical aerial photographs and Sanborn fire insurance maps to evaluate the potential for contaminated materials to exist from the earliest state of development or use of the property. Desktop review also includes the review of USGS topographical maps and USDA soil surveys. Search distances or buffers used for desktop review vary based on the context of the project and the type of contamination source. The project analyst or consultant performing the Level 1 evaluation should coordinate with the DCIC to determine the appropriate buffer distances. The recommended distance is 500 feet from the right-of-way line for petroleum, dry cleaning, and other non-petroleum sites. Corridors in urban areas with dewatering planned near contaminated sites need to be addressed with FDEP. The recommended distance from the right-of-way is 1,000 feet for non-landfill solid waste sites and brownfields. The recommended distance from the right-of-way is a half mile for CERCLA sites, National Priority List (NPL) sites, and landfills. These sites are typically large and can extend long distances from the address locations identified in the databases. Regulatory databases provide the most information regarding sites that have been subject to regulatory inspection or enforcement. The regulatory databases can be identified in the EST or from commercial database vendors. Commercial environmental databases have limitations. Thus, the project analyst should supplement information from field reviews, from a thorough file review, and from other sources of identification as readily available. The following sources listed and available in the EST should be considered in evaluating potential contamination on a project. Other sources include FDEP's Oculus database, FDOT right-of-way maps, and county or other local sources. This is an example of an EST screen map with potential contamination sites shown with various symbols. In this area of Bartow, Florida, the predominant type of site are FDEP storage tank contamination monitoring sites, which are shown as red squares. There are also numerous green triangles indicating the US EPA hazardous waste facilities, and yellow triangles which indicate solid waste facilities. Once sites are identified using screening databases, the actual records, such as monitoring reports and inspection reports, can be reviewed. In Florida, the most useful database is FDEP's Oculus database, especially if the facility ID's number is known. Other sources include FDOT right-of-way information, Sanborn maps, city directories, and other GIS databases. The Oculus database contains a series of catalogs depending on the land use of the site of interest, such as storage tank, hazardous waste, solid waste. Each site typically includes a number of profiles, such as cleanup and remediation or discovery and compliance, which contain relevant reports. Other FDP data sources, such as MapDirect and the Contamination Locator Map, also link directly to the Oculus database. Historic aerial photos are used to review land uses along a project over a period of time. In Florida, aerial photography is usually available in most areas dating back to at least the 1940s and sometimes farther. It's helpful to review aerial photographs for at least 1 year per decade. Historical photos from the 1940s through the 1990s are especially useful for showing potentially now covered landfill sites or other disturbed areas, and former gas station sites that have been redeveloped. Aerial photos may have identified landfilling or other earth-disturbing activities, historical non-regulated gas stations, past agricultural uses, trucking facilities, possible cattle dip vats, and heavy industrial uses. Historical aerial photographs are available from commercial vendors such as EDR, the USGS, FDOT, and county websites. USGS topographical maps and USDA soil maps may also show suspect contamination-related features such as areas of fill, structures, and landfilling areas. A field review or site reconnaissance is performed at each site identified during the desktop review and to observe potential additional sites that may not have been identified during the desktop review. The DCIC or their representatives should participate in the field reviews. Typical sites of concern include gas stations and other former gas stations, dry cleaners, other hazardous waste handlers, auto garages and repair shops, landfills, businesses with industrial operations, railroad lines, NPL or Superfund sites, and junkyards and scrapyards. Sites can be observed from the right-of-way, from public property available as access, or they can be accessed as using a property access letter. Observations should include searching for mounds or depressions, sinkholes, surface staining, or distressed vegetation, suspicious odors, drums, or other chemical containers. The field review should include observing evidence for petroleum storage systems, such as USTs, ASTs, ventilation pipes, and other dispenser islands. It should include observing existing and abandoned monitoring wells and indications of existing or former remediation systems, such as trench-covered well vats, vaults, and equipment enclosure compounds. Evidence of current and former land uses, as well as information regarding above-ground and underground utilities should be noted. Photographs should be taken of each site. Bridge crossings should be observed for their bridge number, estimated age, and condition of surfaces, paint, or concrete. The DCIC should coordinate with the district structures engineer, district bridge engineer, district maintenance engineer, and district facilities engineer as appropriate when survey or abatement actions are required for facilities or structures that have or may have ACM, LBP, or MBC. The district structures engineer, district bridge engineer, district maintenance engineer, district facilities engineer may have additional information acquired during surveys or previous maintenance activities regarding ACM and MBC on structure bridges within the project. Interviews with present and past owners, operators, and/or occupants of the property with contamination concerns and local government officials such as fire department staff may be used to verify or supplement the results of desktop and field reviews. Interview resources typically include interviews with knowledgeable site owners or site occupants. Discussion may include recent or historical uses of the property and any involvement with regulatory agencies or the fire department. Interviews with regulatory agencies, especially site managers for any FDP sites. This would include getting the most recent FDP site status information. Interview with other local government officials such as fire departments, FDOT, maintenance and right-of-way offices, or permitting agencies. FDOT uses contamination risk rating systems to evaluate the likelihood that a contaminated site may have impact on a project. The ratings are as follows. No, there is essentially no risk of contamination concerns at this site. Low, the site may have had current or past involvement with hazardous materials or petroleum products in some capacity, but there does not appear to be any current concerns based on the review of conceptual or design plans and/or findings from the contamination screening evaluation. Medium, after review of the plans, the contamination screening and/or testing, the potential for contamination impacts to the project had been identified. There is suspicion that contamination may exist on the property. Gasoline stations that have not been fully evaluated and those that remain active and abandoned underground storage tank sites should receive this rating. A recommendation for further assessment or impact avoidance must be made. High, the contamination evaluation and testing have indicated that contamination involvement will likely impact construction. These sites will require further assessment and remediation to determine the limits of impacts. Specific recommendations for further assessment must be made. The risk ratings should consider proposed construction activities and determine if the scope of work may cause direct contact with the contamination. The risk ratings must be seriously considered because medium and high risk rated sites will be evaluated further, while no and low rated sites will not likely need further review or evaluation. A rating of medium or high should include a list of the analytical parameters of concern and the media, soil or groundwater, a discussion of the potential involvement with the right-of-way acquisition or construction, and if the site is anticipated to warrant additional assessment. Ratings can change based on changes of the design, methods of construction such as driven piles versus drilled shafts, right-of-way needs, and other factors.
Lesson 4 will cover the contents included in the Contamination Screening Evaluation Report, or CSER, and will provide examples of the included information. For PD&E studies, documentation of a contamination screening evaluation is typically provided in a CSER. A Level 1 evaluation report can be prepared for projects that do not have a PD&E study. A technical memorandum is prepared for projects with no contamination impacts or with minimal involvement with contamination. The CSER, or Level 1 evaluation report, documents the methodology and contamination screening results. The report also includes data reviewed, findings, previous remedial actions, a risk rating for each potentially contaminated site, conclusions about the findings of the evaluation, and recommendations for additional actions. Risk ratings, conclusions, and recommendations presented in the report must be supported by data. If known or potentially contaminated sites are identified, their locations should be clearly marked on the map that shows the project alternatives. The level of detail of the CSER depends on the complexity and scope of the project, severity of potential contaminated sites, and number of potential contaminated sites. The CSER cover page provides the important project information shown in this slide, including the project name, roadway limits, project district, and financial management number. The cover page contains information shown here as required on Figure 20-2 of Part 2, Chapter 20 of the FDOT PD&E Manual. After the cover page, the CSER begins with the following sections. Table of contents. It is customary for an executive summary to precede the table of contents. Introduction is typically brief and should be consistent with the introduction developed for other PD&E studies. Project description is typically brief discussion of the proposed improvements and should be consistent with the project description developed for the other PD&E study reports. This section includes a project location map. Project alternatives is a brief description of the project alternatives that should be consistent with the other PD&E documents. This section includes a table with the number of ranked sites, no, low, medium, and high listed for each project alternative. The project location map, which is typically included in the project description section of a CSER, is shown here along with an alternatives table showing the risk ratings of all the sites associated with each project alternative. This table is typically included in the project alternatives section. The CSER continues with the following sections. Methodology is a detailed discussion of the entire methodology and sources used, desktop field review, regulatory review, etc. It is especially important to describe how sites were selected for further evaluation or were omitted from further review. Land uses describes current and historical land uses. It describes the overall results of the aerial photo review process and the data from historical city directories. This section typically includes a land use map if available. Hydrologic features is a brief description of the regional geology, including hydrogeological units, topography of the study area, surface water features, and soils data. Interviews provides documentation of conversations with site owners, occupants, regulatory authorities, and other agencies. The final sections of the CSER include the following information. Project impacts is the section that contains the most detailed information in the CSER, to include a history of land uses at each site. It summarizes the regulatory data for each site, including its regulatory status, describes the field observations for each site, and summarizes any testing data associated with each site. A risk rating for each site is included in this section. The project impact section should include a table with all of the relevant information on Figure 20-3 of Part 2 of the PD&E manual, listed on the next slide, and especially contamination sources of concern, contamination rating, distance from right-of-way, USTs, ASTs, and other contamination-related information. The project impact section typically includes a detailed map showing all of the potentially contaminated sites, or it references an appendix that contains such a map, as indicated on the following slide. Conclusions and recommendations is a section that contains a brief summary of findings, including how many no, low, medium, and high rank sites were identified, and recommendations for further investigations for all medium and high rank sites. The cost estimates associated with the proposed further investigations or remediation are included in this section, if available. Appendices typically include electronic regulatory database radius reports, photographs, site review checklists and field notes, copies of historical aerial photographs, interview notes, and regulatory files. An example of a CSER table is shown here, with the relevant information recommended on Figure 20-3 of Part 2 of the PD&E manual, especially contamination sources of concern, contamination rating, distance from right-of-way, USTs, ASTs, and other contamination-related information. This example provides a detailed map showing all of the potential contamination sites, locations for this particular project.
Lesson 5 covers the types of environmental documents that contain contamination information and describes how the contamination information is included in these documents. The contamination evaluation is used to support the NEPA documentation developed as part of the project development process. Contamination information is typically provided in the CSER Level 1 Evaluation Report or Technical Memorandum. Documentation of contamination should be included in the environmental document. The contamination documents are used to support the following types of documents as part of the NEPA process. Type 1 categorical exclusions or CEs and non-major state actions. Type 2 categorical exclusions, environmental assessments and environmental impact statements, state environmental impact reports, and reevaluations. For both Type 1 CEs and non-major state actions, contamination involvement is considered, and a brief summary is included in the appropriate checklist. Type 1 categorical exclusion checklist, or the non-major state actions checklist. For both types of projects, the Level 1 evaluation report or technical memorandum, as well as any subsequent evaluation information, is included in the project file. The Type 1 CE checklist form is shown here, with the area indicated in Item 10 to include contamination information. The contamination section is filled in as Item 10 on page 3. This form is provided in Part 1, Chapter 2 of the FDOT PD&E Manual, Class of Action Determination for Highway Projects. Projects which are Type 2 categorical exclusions may have contamination involvement, provided that the involvement is determined not to be significant. The determination should be supported by the findings of the CSER and the guidance in Part 1, Chapter 5 of the FDOT PD&E Manual. The contamination resource is checked on the Type 2 CE determination form as follows. No involvement if there is no contamination issued for the preferred alternative. A technical memorandum should be included in the file. No, if there are no contamination impacts to the project, summarize the CSER technical memorandum and include in the file. No, if the contamination involvement is present and the impacts of the contaminated sites are not significant, summarize the CSER and include it in the file. Yes, if the contamination involvement cannot be avoided and could result in substantial consequences. A determination of significance for contamination is rare and can generally be resolved by application of the procedures in Part 2, Chapter 20 of the FDOT PD&E Manual. This is an example of the Type 2 categorical exclusion checklist form with the area indicated to include contamination information. Contamination section is filled in under Item 3, Environmental Analysis, Section D, Physical, Number 3. This form is provided in Part 1, Chapter 5 of the PD&E Manual, Type 2 categorical exclusions. CSER findings are summarized in the environmental analysis section of an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. A summary table of impacts for each alternative should also be provided. The comments and coordination section of an EA or EIS should discuss and include letters from agencies expressing comments on the Level 1 evaluation. Resolution of comments shall be discussed in the section. For an EA with a finding of no significant impact, the document will include a statement indicating the effect of the project. If contaminated sites affect the preferred alternative, the impact should be discussed in the EIS, ROD, FEIS, or EA with a FONSI. These documents should also discuss the remediation and mitigation measures planned to eliminate or minimize the impacts of contamination. SEERs should include the results of the contamination screening evaluation in the environmental analysis section of the State Environmental Impact Report form by placing an X in the appropriate column of the form. If there are no contamination sites in the project area, mark no involvement. If the project will benefit from the cleanup of adjacent contaminated sites, mark enhance. If there are no contaminated sites in the project area, if there are contaminated sites in the project area, but there are no impacts or the impacts is not substantial, mark no. If the project is potential for substantial impact, mark yes. Justification for the decision is provided in the supporting information column by summarizing the CSER findings. The CSER or technical memorandum is included in the project file. Commitments regarding contamination must be documented in the CSER form and in the project commitments records form. Any change to contamination impacts after the approved environmental document must be reevaluated during design change or construction and consistent with Part 1, Chapter 13 of the FDOT PD&E Manual. Design changes on the approved PD&E concept should be evaluated for potential contamination concerns. Updates to the contamination status of the resolution should be discussed with the reevaluation form. Sites identified in the CSER with a medium or high risk rating are addressed as warranted, and the results are progressively updated with subsequent reevaluations. Final resolution of the disposition and the methods of addressing potentially contaminated sites during construction should be summarized in the reevaluation.
Lesson 6 will explain the purpose of the Level 2 assessment and discuss additional considerations regarding contamination that may occur during design. A Level 2 assessment, also known as an impact to construction assessment, is performed at medium and high-ranked sites to assess the type and extent of potential contamination impacts to construction activities on the project or right-of-way acquisition. The work is typically performed during the design phase of a project, but may be performed during the PD&E phase for projects with accelerated design activities or when it is required to substantiate the impact of potentially contaminated sites on the preferred alternative. These projects are normally funded in the 5-year work program. Level 2 assessments should consist of further evaluation with consideration of updated information, changes in design, review of design details, and/or right-of-way acquisition status. A Level 2 assessment may include site access and sampling and testing of soil, ground, and groundwater, if appropriate. If the Level 2 assessment indicates that contamination is present at a site and involvement is anticipated, further assessment is warranted to define how the contaminants will be avoided, removed, or handled in the project area. The DCIC uses the district's CAR contract to perform Level 2 assessments. Sampling during Level 2 assessments may include asbestos and metal-based coating surveys. For design build and public-private partnership or P3 projects, the Level 2 assessment may occur earlier in the project schedule than usual to ensure contamination issues are given full consideration in the design build or P3 process. For these projects, the FDOT can adjust the assessment requirements based on additional information and plans that are made available for review during the process. Level 2 assessments also may involve evaluating primary and alternative pond sites. For developing the scope of Level 2 activities, it is important to review design changes that may occur after PD&E, such as utilities added via utility work by highway contractor agreement or UWHCA, revised pond locations, construction, excavation items added to a project, such as mast arms, cross drains, and other drainage features. The Level 2 assessment methodology should be developed and coordinated between the project analyst, project manager, and DCIC before beginning assessment. For guidance on assessment methods and cleanup target levels, refer to the FDEP's website, as well as Chapter 62-780 and 62-777 of the Florida Administrative Code. If the results of Level 2 assessments indicate contamination issues are not present in the project area, including the sites identified in the Level 1 report, or if no involvement with contamination or contaminated soil or groundwater will occur as part of the right-of-way acquisition or due to the nature of proposed construction activities, no further assessment should be required unless there is a record of new discharges of a contaminant which occurred after the assessment was completed. If the Level 2 assessment indicates that contamination is present at a site and involvement is anticipated, further assessment is warranted to define how contaminants will be avoided, removed, or handled in the project area. This slide shows a typical map that presents the result of a Level 2 investigation. This map shows the locations of soil borings and temporary monitoring wells. An area of groundwater contamination is shown in the green circle. The DCIC should perform the following activities during the design phase. Review of the status of known or identified contaminated sites undergoing regulatory review or remedial action for baseline information. Coordinate with regulatory agencies as necessary, such as coordination with FDEP for projects that require use of the 2014 MOU between FDEP and FDOT, or with water management districts for projects that require dewatering permits. coordinate level 2 assessments if warranted for the project, and coordinate with assigned right-of-way agent and design project manager as appropriate. Review the inclusion of plume identification, dewatering, or proper site-specific contamination plan notes to be included in the design plans when appropriate, or preparation of modified special provisions related to contamination. Verify commitments included in the approved environmental document are appropriately addressed during the design phase. If possible, remediate contamination prior to construction activities using the district-wide CAR contract. The DCIC supports the district's right-of-way staff in evaluating parcels proposed for acquisition. Right-of-way acquisition may involve property or parcels with contamination issues. The DCIC provides information regarding the potential for contamination involvement with the parcel. If remediation is required, the DCIC works with the right-of-way and construction offices to advance parcel acquisition as early as possible to allow sufficient time for remediation. The DCIC may also be required to assist with cleanup of spills in the FDOT right-of-way when spill cleanup is not performed in a timely manner by the responsible party or by emergency response agencies. Issues related to ACM and BC and the presence of hazardous materials may also be a concern for acquired properties. The DCIC may also be responsible for dealing with hazardous materials and petroleum products issued at district operations and maintenance facilities. If contaminated areas cannot be avoided on the project, the location should be marked on the plans. Examples of marked issues include contaminated soil, above-ground storage tanks, underground storage tanks, pump islands, monitoring wells, and groundwater contamination plumes. General notes concerning contamination or other contamination notes are no longer allowed on design plans, and they may conflict with specifications. Handling of known or unknown contamination issues will be through the use of applicable specifications. If existing specifications do not adequately address the contamination, the DCIC should work with the engineer of record to develop modified special provisions, or MSPs, and technical special provisions, or TSPs, if appropriate, to ensure contaminated materials are handled and disposed of properly. Development of MSPs or TSPs requires coordination with the district and state specifications engineer, as outlined in the specifications package preparation procedure. Topic number 630-010-005. This is an example of markings on plans. In this case, the area marked on the plans will require a level 2 investigation to confirm that contamination is not a concern.
Lesson 7 briefly describes some considerations regarding Level 3 activities performed to remediate contamination along FDOT projects. Level 3 assessment activities can take place during the design phase when acquiring right-of-way, prior to the start of construction, or during construction. Completion prior to construction is preferred. These activities require coordination to ensure the appropriate funding for remediation is allocated prior to project letting. Remediation activities at each site should have a clear scope of work that conforms to regulatory requirements. Generally, the guidelines used by FDEP for remediation will be appropriate when soil or groundwater remediation are necessary. However, FDOT's limited liability for contamination in its right-of-way per Section 337.27 of the Florida statutes should be considered when determining the extent of remediation needed. Petroleum-related Level 3 activities should be coordinated with the FDP, consistent with the 2014 Memorandum of Understanding between FDEP and FDOT, which addresses discharges of petroleum pollutants from off-site sources properties to state highways. Remedial activities Level 3 could involve soil, groundwater, liquids, sludges, solids, asbestos coating materials, metal-based coatings, and other contaminants. The construction contractor normally does not handle contaminated material during the construction phase. The district's CAR contractor handles the contamination. FDOT is responsible for remediating or removing the contamination prior to work by the construction contractor, unless it's encountered unexpectedly. Contamination issues should be resolved prior to construction if possible. Some contamination issues may be handled during construction if the source of contamination is outside the right-of-way, if earlier remediation is not possible, or if it's encountered during construction. The construction activities cannot be allowed to exacerbate the contamination or change the distribution of the contamination. Typically, a Level 3 scope of work is developed with the car contractor to plan the remedial activities. Remedial activities at active FDEP petroleum sites should be coordinated with FDEP.
The final lesson, Lesson 8. The final lesson, Lesson 8, will address in some detail several additional considerations regarding contamination that were not fully covered in the prior lessons. Additional considerations related to contamination on FDOT projects include the following: the 2014 Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, between FDEP and FDOT, circular and Superfund sites, ACM and NBC surveys, use of bridge debris as an artificial reef, and dewatering during construction. In June 2014, FDEP and FDOT entered into a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, to address discharges of petroleum pollutants in the FDOT transportation facilities. The 2014 MOU encourages cooperation between FDOT and FDEP regarding the following. FDEP prioritizes, subject to the availability of funds from inland petroleum trust funds or other approved trust funds, assessment and remediation of petroleum contamination located within FDOT transportation facilities and future transportation projects, regardless of the source property priority score. FDOT establishes a procedure to allow risk-based closure through development of a map note for dischargers who cannot readily access or remediate their petroleum pollutants that have spilled upon or migrated to FDOT's transportation facility. The MOU memorializes the process to expedite assessment and remediation of petroleum contaminated sites that potentially impact economically significant transportation projects through use of FDEP petroleum trust funds. Once a determination is made of MOU eligibility, FDOT can request that one of the following happen: FDEP to prioritize assessment and remediation of the site, or funding or reimbursement for remediation of the trust fund eligible dischargers petroleum pollutants in the transportation facility if FDEP cannot prioritize assessment and remediation activities for the eligible discharge. The MOU further memorializes the process to establish alternative institutional controls to address petroleum discharges that may have migrated into the FDOT right-of-way when the discharger or person responsible for site rehab petitions to FDEP for no further action, or NFA. CERCLA stands for the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, also known as Superfund. When a CERCLA or an abandoned Superfund site is located within the project limits, the Office of General Counsel should be contacted if the contamination has the potential to be exacerbated by project activities. The DCIC also should coordinate with the EPA and/or the FDEP if they have been given delegation for any remedial action decisions that are made for the site. FDOT is responsible for protecting employees, contractors, and the public through inspections and proper management, handling and removal of asbestos-containing materials and metal-based coatings. Asbestos-containing materials and metal-based coatings surveys should be performed as early as possible in the design phase, possibly as early as PD&E, to allow for an evaluation of impacts prior to construction. The survey must be conducted according to the asbestos management procedure in the right-of-way procedures manual, topic number 575-000-000. If an asbestos containing materials and metal-based coating survey has not been conducted, the DCIC should make sure the surveys are performed on all bridges and other structures planned for demolition or renovation. If the project involves replacement, modification, or rehabilitation of the bridge constructed in 1980 or earlier, include the following standard statement in the asbestos containing materials and metal-based coatings survey report. Based on the age of the bridge, lead-based coatings shall be assumed to be present within faying surfaces or splices and top flanges embedded in concrete decks as well as other surfaces. Abatement plans for handling, management, and removal of asbestos-containing materials and lead-based coatings must be prepared before demolition, modification, or rehabilitation of the bridge. Bridge decks may have mastics and concrete that can contain asbestos. Tinder houses contain several types of suspect materials, including mastics, floor tiles, and ceiling tiles. Other structures, like these buildings at a rest area shown on the left side, may have asbestos-containing materials on flooring, walls, roofs, and exterior surfaces. For coastal bridge replacement projects, consideration may be given to using clean bridge debris as an artificial reef. Consideration for use of debris as an artificial reef will include materials management, testing, storage, cost, and/or transport of the materials, as well as permitting and the agreements that are necessary. The consideration of coordination with the appropriate agencies, FDEP, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Florida Fish and Wildlife, and with other stakeholders, once it is determined that demolition is the preferred alternative for the project. The work must also be coordinated with the appropriate FDOT staff, including the design project manager, project engineer, environmental manager, district permits coordinator, construction project manager, and DCIC. The consideration should occur as early in the design phase as possible. Also see Part 1, Section 110.5.2.3 of the FDOT Design Manual, topic number 625-000-002 for more guidance. Construction activities may require dewatering. Dewatering operations must obtain a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, generic permit for discharge of groundwater. Dewatering operations seeking coverage under the NPDES generic permit for stormwater discharges from large and small construction activities under subsection 62-621.300 of the Florida Administrative Code are not required to obtain separate coverage under subsection 62-621.300 of the Florida Administrative Code. For FDP to issue an NPDES generic permit for discharge of groundwater from dewatering operations, an evaluation of potential contamination impacts must be completed. This evaluation should include sampling for the appropriate contaminants of concern to determine if groundwater treatment is necessary prior to discharge within 500 feet of the dewatering area before permit application. Any pollutants of concern present in groundwater at the dewatering site at concentrations equal to or exceeding the surface water criteria under subsection 62-302.530 of the Florida Administrative Code must be remediated, otherwise the dewatering operation will not qualify for permit under subsection 62-621.300 of the Florida Administrative Code. Therefore, dewatering operations in areas identified with contamination issues require treatment of effluent to limits and requirements specified in the NPDES generic permit.